So, I'd like to talk some more about conversation analysis. When we learn to talk in a managed conversation, we're often told, don't talk while I'm talking, right? Our parents, when we interrupt them, sometimes they might say something like that. But we know that in real conversation, there's certainly no reason or expectation that there's only one speaker talking at a time. Look at what's going on here. Pause if you want to take a minute to read it to make sure you see what's going on. But let me talk through it, right? E is telling a story about an accident. Like there was a bus right there. Like there was a bus right there, man, in that blind spot there. And I looked, and N starts talking over top saying, yeah. And now E is saying, notice that E's turn continues from line 2 to line 4. So E says, and I looked through and I didn't see, and S is talking over now saying, and he's driving through, because S was in the car with E, and E is saying, I looked through and I didn't see anything, so I went through, and S is talking over top saying, and I'm just screaming my lungs out, and E's going, and you just screamed and I just stopped, and S is saying, slammed on the brakes in the middle of the intersection. And look at how in line 9, for example, E was talking and saying, and so I went through. And in line 6, E says, anything, so I went through. And in line 7, S is saying, and I'm just screaming at the same time, right? Line 6 and line 7 overlap. Anything, so I went through overlaps with, and I'm just screaming. But then almost right after, E can say, you just screamed and I just stopped. E can paraphrase what S just said, despite having been talking when S said it, right? You know this. This is just some evidence to show it. But you know that we are very good at listening to someone else talk while we ourselves talk, and sometimes even listening to a third conversation, right? Or just to a second conversation and being able to talk about this, but listen to them, right? Our brains can process a lot all at once. Some of the things I want to talk about now explain how we do that, right? How are we able to do so much at once when there's a lot of content coming in and going out, and even another stream of content over there. It's because we have these rules that we follow. It's not that we have to follow them, but that we tend to follow when we want a conversation to work. Turn allocation. How do we know whose turn it is to speak next? Much of the time, turn allocation is done through other selection. You're talking and you select an other person to talk. Simple, right? We do it in a few ways. Have you got the papers, Carol? You've nominated the person to speak by saying Carol. So it's pretty obvious that it's Carol's turn to talk. It doesn't mean Carol has to talk. It doesn't mean someone else might not talk at that time, or that Carol might choose not to talk for whatever reason. But it's expected by J that C will talk at this point. Or just through the look itself, right? How are you? You don't have to say, how are you, Harry? How are you? Whilst looking at Harry. And it's pretty obvious that you're directing the talk to Harry. And can you pass the butter? Here, even without looking, if you're at a dinner table, as it says here, probably would depend on the context, who's closest, right? Can you pass the butter? Even if the closest person has a knife and fork in their hands, someone further might quickly respond, I'll do it, because they see that the closest person is busy, so it's situational. But in all of these cases, the can you pass the butter may lead to, it prompts some sort of interaction. It may not prompt an I'll do it. You might just pick it up and hand it over without talking. But in all of these cases, the person talking is selecting another person to talk. Not particularly difficult to understand. Self-selection is sometimes a little more tricky. The next speaker chooses to speak despite being nominated to do so. Now here, S just says, God, what a day. At that point, S's turn is finished. If we remember concepts that I discussed earlier, such as turn completion, grammar, intonation, and action. God, what a day. Probably we'd hear the intonation fall, what a day. And it's completed as an action. S is commenting on his or her current feelings, right? Presumably the day was tough, right? At that point, S doesn't say, can someone else talk now? What did you think, T, or what did you think, M? But so there's no indication in the language that someone else should talk. Unlike with other selection, when you say, God, what a day, how was your day, T, and you use other selection to nominate T. Here, there's no selection in the language to prompt someone else to talk. But because of the social nature of the conversation, it feels, I'm sure, to T and to M that if they want this conversation to keep going, if they want to keep having a chat, a social event to show their friendship, someone should say something. So it's not the language that prompts T or M to talk, but the social context that prompts one of them to talk. Now, it could have been M, but it wasn't. It was T in this case. Self-selection. There's an opportunity, a TRP, a transition relevance place, which you should know from the previous talk. There's a transition relevance place at the end of line 1. T chooses to talk. Same thing at the end of line 2. How, what a week. In fact, M can probably project, how, what a week, and say, this is going to end soon, this turn. I can start talking now, and in fact, overlaps a bit. So, turn allocation is done through self-selection or other selection. A few other things I want to go over now. Other areas of interest for conversation analysis. We'll go over these one by one in more detail. How do we start conversations? In a phone call, how do you make a phone call? How do you receive a phone call? Pretty simple, right? Pick up the phone, say hello. The other person says hello and start talking. Although there is more nuance to that. Look what's happened here, right? The phone rings and is picked up and there's a silence for a bit. So what happens here? The caller actually says hello first. Hello? So obviously either the answer, A, didn't speak first, which we'd expect, right? Usually when you answer the phone, you speak first. Either the answer didn't speak first or spoke but wasn't heard. So this phone call is a little more complex than usual because the caller speaks first. And then we have these usual steps of the greeting, hello, hello. But it's not entirely a greeting. There's a bit of a check, right? It's not just hello, it's hello. Like, hello, is anyone there? And then we have the ID check. We often do this, right? Who's talking? Sometimes it's done by the caller. Hello, this is Sean calling from Santander Bank, something like that, right? So there's the greeting. What's a phone call typically open with? Greetings and check for the connection. Is anyone there? And check for identification. Who's talking to whom, right? Phone call openings and closings are reasonably simple. There aren't as many options available to us. Like, look at the closing here. If you ask someone how does the phone call end, they'll typically say, well, you say goodbye and hang up, right? That's line 5 and 6. Bye, bye. But look at the lines before that. Think about how phone calls rarely just end with, could you skip lines 3 and 4? So they've obviously been talking about meeting. And E says, so we'll do it at 7:30. S says, it'll be fun. Could you skip right to 5? So we'll do it at 7:30. It'll be fun. Bye, bye. Possible, but unusual. There's often this extra step, the okay step, the pre-closing, right? So I'll meet you at the restaurant tomorrow at about 5 o'clock, right? Yeah, that sounds great. I'm looking forward to it. Okay, okay, bye, bye. That step there, the pre-closing, the closing is line 5 and 6. The pre-closing is the last chance, right? Last chance to say something, to introduce any new topics, to confirm. E says, it's as if E in line 3 is saying, all right, shall we finish this conversation? And S says, okay, let's finish this conversation. They don't actually say those words, but because we've had so many phone calls and we've closed so many phone calls, we know that that's what's meant at those turns, lines 3 and 4. A lot of conversation is managed by this idea that we speak in pairs of turns that are adjacent to one another. I say hello, you say hello. That's an adjacency pair. I say, what's your name? You say, my name is whatever it is. That's an adjacency pair, right? Question and answer. Hello, what's your name? Sorry, question and answer. What's your name? I'm Sean. Greeting, greeting. Hello, hello. We know that these pairs belong together because we especially see it when something doesn't work, right? H says, did you speak to Mary today? there's an expected closing there. H wants the closing. The pair is opened with "Did you speak to Mary today?" H wants it to close. It doesn't. There's a 2-second pause. So H repeats it. "Did you speak to Mary?" J closes it. "Oh, yeah, I saw her at lunch." Adjacency pairs, there's numerous ones, right? Here's a list of some of them. Numerous adjacency pairs possible. A lot of conversation progresses through by opening a pair and then closing a pair. One person opens it and the other one closes it. The list here is not exhaustive. There are more, right? The important thing is not to memorize the names on the list and to use them, but rather to just think of the fact that they exist as pairs. If something else happens, if something different happens, name it yourself. Say, here it appears that A does this and B does that. Think of them as actions, right? There's the action of greeting should be followed by the action of greeting. We don't care what the words are. It can be hello, hello, or maybe I say hello, and the expected action is for you to have another greeting. Whether you say hello or hi or how are you or what's up or what's going on or hey, doesn't matter. It's not the words that matter so much, it's the actual action, right? A greeting should be followed by a greeting. An invitation should be followed by agreement or disagreement, and so on. The last point here, the preferred response is usually easy. A dispreferred response may require some hedging or mitigation. This is very interesting. What this means is that the preferred response is if you say something to me and I reply in the way that you want me to, that's called the preferred response. If you say something to me and I reply in a way that I know is not the answer you want, that's called a dispreferred response. It's usually easy for the responder to do the thing that the one who started the pair wants. In other words, it's easy to say yes to a request, more difficult to say no, right? You say, do you want to have lunch? I say, yes, great. You say, do you want to have lunch? I already ate today. Sorry, maybe another time. That may or may not be true, but I say it with a lot more elaboration, right? If you say, do you want to have lunch? And I give the preferred response, yes, let's go. It's easy. Do you want to have lunch? Sorry, I already have had lunch. Maybe another time. I've got more units in that turn, right? I apologize, sorry, I give an excuse, I already ate lunch, I make an offer for a further, to do so at a later time, how about tomorrow? I found myself thinking about this when a stranger asked me for money outside of Good Street Station a while ago. He said, excuse me, brother, could you spare a couple of pounds? Excuse me, brother, could you spare a couple of pounds? What's his preferred response? That I say yes and give him a couple of pounds. What's his dispreferred response? Anything else. I know this, right? And I know the easy thing is to say yes and give him some money. But that's not what happens. But even though I don't know him, there's no reason I should feel beholden to him, to giving him money. It's still what comes out shows that I'm aware of the fact that this is a dispreferred response. I say something like, sorry, not today. This is one turn, sorry, not today, but it's got 3 separate units in those 4 words. It pains me to give this dispreferred response. And then I apologize, sorry. Why am I apologizing for not doing something that there's no reason that I should do? I can't possibly give money to every person who asks me for money. And yet I apologize. And then not today. I extend the possibility of giving some money tomorrow or the next day or sometime in the future, right? If I was telling the truth, he'd say, can you spare a couple of pounds? I'd say no. But I say, sorry, not today. I never actually say no. Now he can play along and say, he can go along with this and say, I see, and let it go. Or he can pretend to not understand what I mean by saying, oh, shall we meet tomorrow? And then you can give me the couple of pounds. Of course, that's not what happened. I shouldn't say of course, because he might have done that, but that's not what he did in this case, right? So we've got the pairs. adjacency pairs, things that happen one after another, and giving the preferred response is easy, giving the dispreferred response is more difficult. Here we have a question and answer, but my answer shows that it was more difficult for me to give that dispreferred response. Repair is a useful concept. When we repair something in written language, we just delete it or cross it out and we write the correct thing instead. You don't tend to see repairs in written language. In spoken language, though, we hear the mistakes people make and we hear the repairs that they make to them. Sometimes we repair what someone else said. A is talking, you know the lecturer Adam, the one who is, and at the same time B says, I think you mean Andrew. B talks over top. A doesn't take this as an interruption. A takes this as a collaboration. A takes this as B trying to make the conversation work properly, because A realizes that B is just repairing some mistake in the conversation, in this case, the name of the lecturer. We also repair ourselves. She's gone to, the at sign here is laughter, right? She's gone to, wait until I show you on the map where she's going. You start to see these features of disfluency, that the person is speaking in a broken up way. To is drawn out, there's laughter, there's there's a pause. These are often signs of the fact that the person realizes that she or he is in trouble at this point, in trouble in that she doesn't know how to continue what she wants to say properly. And so these and other markers, these disfluency markers often tell the person, the listener, Jay, wait a minute, I'm going to fix something here. We don't have to say, I misspoke, let me correct myself. We don't have to say, you misspoke, let me correct you. Because we know that repair is so often a part of spontaneous spoken language that we're listening for them and expecting them to happen. None of us speak fluently for long periods of time without making little errors like this. Sequences is a good term to know. We have the sequence here. You know that the film that's on at the Odeon, a question, it's answered by yes. We have another sequence. Do you want to go and see it tonight? Yeah, why not? Right? That works quite well. We have a pre-sequence and a main sequence. What A really wants is to say, do you want to see a film with me? We gather once we see the whole thing. That's the main point of this. Do you want to go see a film with me? That film that's on at the Odeon, yes, is a pre-sequence. It introduces the topic, but gently, right? When this is often done is when there's a chance of embarrassment for one of the parties, right? If I ask you directly, do you want to go and see the film at the Odeon? If you say no, I may feel hurt that you don't want to go with me. I may feel embarrassed that I asked you if I was asking you on a date, like if it's the first time I've asked you to see a film, I may feel embarrassed. Saying something like, the film that's on at the Odeon, gives B the chance to say something like, no, I don't really watch films, or, well, yeah, I've already seen it, to make an excuse, to start thinking, maybe this is a pre-sequence and it's going to lead to a main sequence that has something to do with Odeon or something to do with films, something to do with one of the content words. We know that this happens, that people use pre-sequences to lead to main sequences. They introduce topics gently, indirectly, and so we can make a move to block the main sequence at that point. Here you have the same thing, but with the lines 4 and 5, you have an insertion sequence, clarification, right? You know the film that's on at the Odeon? Yes, there's an adjacency pair open, that sequence is open and closed. Line 3, do you want to go and see it tonight? That demands a yes or a no. Well, not demands, but it suggests a yes or a no or a maybe. But we have B, insert a sequence for clarification. I guess the timing of the film matters in this case. So what time does it start? Adjacency pair opens. 8:35, adjacency pair closes. Line 6, yeah, why not? That closes the adjacency pair that was opened in line 3 with an insertion sequence. These are things that we're keeping going in our head, right? All these patterns that started and has to be finished. I mean, when I say has to, it never has to be. You can stop a conversation at any time if you don't want to, because you can, if you don't like what you're talking about, if the person bothers you, you can just stop talking and walk away. When I say has to, I mean assuming both participants want the conversation to continue and be successful, they'll be holding these ideas of sequences and adjacency pairs in their heads and trying to make the conversation work by matching up closes to pairs with opens to pairs, and by making sure that sequences do get finished at some time. We also do this through alignment, right? This is a term that you can read about in Knopfsinger and Stivers. We do things to show that we're paying attention to the conversation, that we want the conversation to continue successfully. We do these things that are called aligning, or we use alignment devices to show that. Let me show you some examples of how people show alignment, how they show that they want the conversation to keep working successfully. Em's talking. She arranged a kind of half-surprise birthday party for her at Lee's house on the 17th, invited Janice, and Janice was like, guys, it's my birthday on the 17th. And then B goes, and D laughs and says, awkward. What's D done at this point? Provided an assessment, right? M's told a story. How can D, like, M hasn't asked a question or anything that suggests an obvious thing for D to do. M doesn't say, what do you think of that story? Which would be quite obvious. Well, then I should say, yeah, that sounds awkward. But just the fact that D provides that assessment of the situation, this situation you've described, 2 birthday parties and you forgot about Janice, the fact that D can provide the assessment at that point proves that D was listening. If D hadn't been listening, D couldn't have provided a successful assessment there. So D shows alignment to the conversation. I'm listening, I want this conversation to continue, by assessing the situation. Other forms of alignment are doing the same thing, right? They're showing that you're involved, that you're paying attention by doing something when it's not suggested in the language that you have to. When you're young, your parents may demand that you align to the conversation, right? If you've ever had your parents say, your parent is talking to you and they suspect that you're not listening, and they say, are you listening to me? And you say, what did I, and you say, yes. And they say, what did I just say? Well, at that point, you should perhaps provide an assessment, right? You say something like, you told me that you're disappointed because I haven't cleaned my room. When they say, what did I just say? You don't have to repeat everything they said, right? If they come in and say, look, the clothes are on the floor and the wall is dirty because you painted it, or whatever kids do, right? You don't have to say all of that. In fact, if you repeated all of it, you might actually get in more trouble. But providing the assessment at that point is very valuable, right? To show your parent, yes, despite the fact that it doesn't look like I'm aligned to the conversation, I am in fact listening to you. So it got mixed together. I was only invited today. You got forgotten. What happens? Another form of, instead of an evaluation like in the previous one, here B is just summarizing what was said, being able to, B is in effect saying, I was obviously listening to what you said because I'm able to summarize what you said in different words. You can only do that if you're listening. It shows you're aligning to the conversation. People assume that I've just been, and D is going over top of that. And M says, invited, no one hasn't actually asked me. What's the do? Why there? I'm listening, I'm aligning to the conversation, right? These are called various things. Knopfsinger calls it a continuer. What are you doing when you go, yeah. You're saying continue. You're not necessarily saying you agree, right? Sometimes someone talks and you may say, yeah. It doesn't necessarily mean you agree with what they're saying, because you have those situations where someone says, yeah, that was it was a terrible film. I really hate horror films. And the other person's going, yeah. And then as you stop talking, they go, Yeah, no, I really liked it. I like horror films. So we know that yeah isn't a sign of positive polarity of saying I agree with you. It's just a sign of continue, continue, continue. Uh, Moving away from alignment to talk about pauses, which are a notable feature of spoken language, right? And especially conversation. I mean, you don't hear a pause or see a pause in written language. You don't know when the writer paused to think before writing the next words in the sentence. But we hear those pauses in spoken language. And linguists tend to think of pauses differently than I think most people do. People often say something like pauses are a thinking time. People will say we use pauses for thinking time. But I believe you'll see here that that's not usually the best way to think of pauses. Now, look, sometimes pauses are simply a physical part of the physical process. You talk a lot and you run out of breath and you actually need to take a breath, or you're talking and then there's something happens, someone shouts, so you look to see what's going on. And it's not because you're thinking about what you're saying, it's because you're thinking about that new thing, right? But other times pauses are more meaningful. There's the well-known examples that I've mentioned in the past, right? Will you marry me? Yes, is quite solid. Will you marry me? Followed by a 5-second pause before B says yes, might signal the start of a problematic marriage, right? Not fully committed because it took all that time. Don't think of this as B's thinking time. I doubt B needed 5 seconds to think about whether she or he wanted to marry A. It's not thinking time. You probably already know if you want to marry someone or not. And if someone who just asks you out of the blue, do you want to marry me? You're pretty quick, no, right? If someone you don't know. It's a sign of a problem. Linguists think of pauses as a sign of some kind of problem. Here, the problem is probably that B isn't fully committed, right? Similarly here, right? Did you kill him? You'd better answer quickly without a pause. No, I didn't. Any sort of pause might be seen as a sign of some problem. Are you thinking about an excuse at this time, an alibi, right? Pauses are not usually relevant to turn change, right? To speaker change. People say, people sometimes say things like, okay, H says, did you speak to Mary today? And then pauses so that J can speak. But we take turns so quickly that you don't usually need a pause to know that it's your turn to speak. You know it's your turn to speak because of turn completion, right? Turns being complete by grammar, intonation, and action, as I explained in part 1 of this talk. As we see in lines 3 and 4, did you speak to Mary today? Leads immediately to, oh yeah, I saw her at lunch. Sorry, the line 3, did you speak to Mary today? Leads immediately to, oh yeah, I saw her at lunch. There's no problem there. So the line 2, the pause, really belongs to J, right? H says, did you speak to Mary today? This turn is complete. It's J's turn to talk. The pause is obviously some side of a problem. J wasn't listening because J had headphones in, or J was distracted by work that doing on the computer or something like that. Pauses aren't speaker change. Speaker change is because of turn completion, grammar, intonation, and action. Pauses are a sign of a problem, perhaps, when there should be a speaker change. The limits of conversation analysis. As I said earlier, conversation analysis is a tool that's used to describe turns and to describe those patterns that we follow. I called them rules before, but it's often better to think of patterns because rule makes it seem like you must follow it, whereas pattern says it's a thing we tend to do. Conversation analysis is attempting to provide a list of patterns that we follow that explain the structure of conversation. We can't provide the answers to everything, as it says here, right? There's nowhere where you can go and look at a full list of adjacency pairs and just say, these are all the possibilities. It's more important that you realize that there are adjacency pairs, and that if you come to a new pair that seems to you obvious, oh yeah, when people do this, someone does that, name it yourself. That's fine, right? Give it your own name. That's more important to name the actions rather than try to find someone else's name for them. We don't have all the answers because people are too varied in what they do, but we can try to produce answers case by case as needed. What's happened here? Name it according to the idea that, well, I know people speak in pairs. This is a pair. What name are you going to give it? Give it whatever name you want. Recognize the structure. It's a pair that's a pre-sequence. It's a pair that's a main sequence. It's a pair that's an insertion sequence. We can't use numbers, right? We can't predict 10% of the time when this happens, that happens, but 90% of the time when this happens, that other thing happens. We don't know the numbers. That doesn't matter. We still can say that patterns exist and we follow them. What percent of time do we follow them? Don't know, don't care. Just the fact that we know the patterns exist gives us some way of talking about how we're able to manage conversation when there are so many possibilities. As I just said then, becoming familiar with certain patterns allows us to become more comfortable with identifying new patterns. I've mentioned Sachs, Shegloff, and Jefferson in the first part of this talk. They are the real originators of this. Others may have written about it before, but their paper is the one that really gathered up everything into one place and said, look, these are the terms we're going to use. Or rather, at the time, they would have said, these are the terms we want to use: turn completion, turn allocation. And people agreed with them because everyone knows these terms now, and those are the ones that you want to use in order to talk successfully about language, spoken language, and especially spoken conversation. The other people listed here and numerous others have contributed terms since. Knopfsinger is the one I was talking about when I talked about alignment, for example, and there's a lot more on the reading list and through our library. Good. Thank you very much. Bye.